Navid was living with his parents in a small and poor community. All he's known for his entire life was famine and war. Even though everything was against them, his family had somehow managed to survive. His community, even impoverished by war and hunger, was built on support and help. They supported each other as neighbors to get through life's hardships together. It was not always easy to deal with hunger, especially when the numbers of wounded and the severely sick became higher after a bombing or an armed confrontation. Getting food and sustenance was becoming increasingly difficult. Even though no one was capable of attacking their neighbor to steal their supplies and rations, they knew the day would come. Everybody dreaded the day where everyone would turn on one another and raid the village for supplies. They knew that anything could happen, and there were no rules to govern the wrath of hungry men. Any parent would forget their humaneness when it came to feeding their starving children in the midst of a severe famine crisis. Even though everyone felt like they were one big family when it came to choose, no one would put anyone above their children. At the time, Navid was only 3 years old and his sister Nora was barely a few weeks old. By that time, everyone knew that the crisis was imminent and that what they feared could happen any day now. The deterioration of the living conditions was slower than they expected, which gave the community some false hope that things would go back to normal in no time. Little did they know, things were going to explode at the moment they expected the least. When the crisis was at its worst, Navid and Nora's parents left early one morning on a mission to get food for their children from a neighboring town. For the first time since the war started, they didn't come back home that night. They were killed in a raid they had planned together with other neighbors in a nearby town. The community was filled with orphans that exceeded the number of adults. The few remaining adults had to take care of the parentless children, and that wasn't going to be an easy task. Everyone had to get by as best as they could. Navid, who was 7 years old, had to take care of his 4-year-old sister. At such a young age, he had no idea what he was going to do. All he knew was that they didn't have the luxury to mourn their parents' death. If they wanted to survive, they had to be strong. Their parents had been buried unceremoniously in the village. The orphan children were going to take shelter at their aunt's house. Things didn't go well from the first day they set foot in her house. Their aunt had a family of her own and had a child to feed. The more time went on, the more it bothered their aunt and husband to have to give a little less food to their son because they had to share with 2 children they barely knew. Even though Navid had been confident that they would be taken care of there and that his sister could grow up in a somewhat normal environment, their stable life wasn't to last. Barely a month after their aunt opened her house door to welcome them, they were alone again. Their aunt and uncle had opened their doors and invited them to leave as they could no longer afford to feed them. Getting through every day was a big hustle, especially for the young Navid who took his sister's responsibility very seriously. Despite his hard work and great struggle, Navid was never able to get enough rations for his little sister to eat well. Since he couldn't provide as much food as necessary, the young boy tried to compensate with games and stories. Navid tried to make Nora forget about the war and the hunger with his stories and the games he'd invent specially for her. Nora grew fond of her older brother who would stop at nothing to make her happy. At night, before going to sleep, he'd create a story of a faraway country where people are happy and could eat and drink plenty. Even though he was the provider, Nora was the one who offered him words of comfort, telling him everything they could do once the hellish nightmare they were going through ended. She'd spend hours telling him about where they would go, what they would eat and what they would study, and all the dreams that a girl who was losing her childhood in the middle of the war could have. One day Nora started to get sick. Her face was pale and her body was only getting thinner. When he saw his sister's state, Navid vanished. When he saw that no matter what he did, he was unable to save his sister, he started to go every day to take a nap by his parents' grave, trying to find comfort, solace, and support. He'd sometimes pretend that he had not lost them. He'd dream of a world where all 4 of them were still living under the same roof, happy and safe. One day, when he went back to the shelter after his afternoon nap, he found Nora worse than ever. The little girl had no more strength. She was barely surviving, clinging to life with all the energy she had left. Navid couldn't help but cry and scream his heart out. He would walk the streets asking for help, and people had already noticed that he was lying between the graves of his parents, not knowing that the grieving boy had a sister who counted on him, one who was a few steps away from death. When a volunteer doctor was finally able to check on Nora, it was too late. The child was too weak and had only a few hours to live. Nora spent her last minutes in Navid's arms. She left this world with a smile on her lips after telling her brother that he would have to be strong. Her last words to her brother were that she was going to join her parents and that they would protect him. Navid broke down that night. The only reason he was fighting to live was gone. Not wanting his sister to be buried in an unmarked grave and be forgotten, he improvised a grave for her next to his parents. Navid would spend all of his days there, eating dirt and plants he didn't know if they were poisonous or not. He drank whatever water he found, not caring about its origin as he had no other choice if he wanted to survive. People were still dying in the streets, falling like flies, but he still had hope. Hope he kept feeding because his sister asked him to. Despite his struggle to stay alive, he was slowly agonizing. The only strength he had left in his body was that of his love for the family he had lost. Even though he did not want to die, the prospect of being reunited with his sister and parents comforted his heart and made death less scary. Navid was suffering greatly, but something inside him also told him that somehow he would survive. And he was not wrong. One morning, he did not wake up next to the grave of his family, but in a hospital bed. The war was finally over. Navid was finally able to receive the care he needed to survive and regain his strength. And even though the doctors had already heard too many painful stories, they could not help crying when Navid told them his heartbreaking story. Hearing him talk about Nora that moved them the most. Navid is a brave boy who went to great lengths to take care of his sister in times where adults abandoned their own children and families. As all great suffering, he was rewarded at the end of his long struggle. Even though he lost everything he cared about and his only reason to live, he also knew that the best way to honor his parents and sister was to strive to live the best life possible. The best way he could make their memory live longer was for him to have the life they weren't able to get. Despite the pain of loss he had to live with every day, Navid found his strength in his family's memory. They became the fuel of everything he did. He had to honor his sister's last words and live the dreams they were drawing together every night before they slept. War is ugly on so many aspects. It not only leaves orphaned children and destroys families, it leaves scars in ways too heady for children to bear. Children like Navid, who now has to carry that weight until he dies.